cannot live without thee. I dare not try to take one step alone. I cannot bear the loads of life unaided. I need thy strength to lean myself upon. Be with me, Lord, and then if dangers threaten, if storms of trial burst above my head, if flashing seas leap everywhere about me, they cannot harm or make my heart afraid. Be with me, Lord, no other gift or blessing thou couldst bestow could with this one compare. A constant sense of thy abiding presence, where'er I am, to feel that thou art near. Be with me, Lord, when loneliness o'ertakes me, when I must weep amid the fires of pain, and when shall come the hour of my departure for worlds unknown. O Lord, be with me then.
Well, it is good to be back again tonight. Good to see all of you present. And we're moving on slowly but deliberately to the book of Acts. We might finish it eventually, I suppose. We'll take some giant leaps before very long. But tonight we're looking at chapter 17. And you remember that last week we looked at the variety of experiences that Paul had at Philippi, the first place in Europe in which the gospel was preached. First of all, the meeting with the women down at the place of prayer, then being followed by that demon-possessed girl, and then the beating and being cast into prison. And then finally we saw Paul leaving the city with dignity after insisting that the magistrates, the leaders of the city, should come personally and ask them to leave. Now, Paul was not doing that because he was standing on his dignity or being awkward about it, but he did it in order to make sure that when he wanted to return, he could return. That he wouldn't sneak out like a dog with his tail between his legs, but he'd go out with dignity and leave the way open to come back to Philippi at any time that he wanted to. Now, having left Philippi, he and his companions travelled westward along the way that was known as the Egnatian Way. It was a very busy Roman way that ran all the way from Philippi, 100 miles to Thessalonica, which was the capital of Macedonia, the capital of the province of Macedonia. If you read chapter 17, you'll discover there that they passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia. That's what it says there, which means they didn't stop there to preach. And I'll tell you what that tells me. It tells me that Paul was somewhat selective in the places at which he stayed. If for any reason Paul saw that he would be wasting his time in a particular place, he had a little more sense than we have today. He didn't waste his time and energy there, but he moved on. And certainly, so far as Amphipolis and Apollonia were concerned, there was no real reason why he should stay there. For example, Amphipolis, to begin with, was a Roman military station. It was a military town. It was stationed on that very important road with the purpose of maintaining the peace and the order. And the very name Amphipolis means the city that is beset on all sides. So that gives you some idea of the kind of atmosphere that must have reigned in that soldier's town. And consequently, he didn't stay there. That was about 33 miles west of Philippi. And then a further 27 miles, we have this place Apollonia. And there again, we know there was no synagogue in Apollonia, and the very name tells you what the place was. It was a town, a fairly small town, dedicated to the god Apollo. Apollo's town, really, that's what it was. And consequently, being a centre of pagan worship, they didn't stop there either. No, they kept on moving until they came another 37 or so miles all the way to Thessalonica, which was, as I say, the capital of the province of Macedonia. And by the way, how do you suppose they travelled? Well, they didn't get the bus, that's one thing you can guarantee, or they didn't get an internal flight either. And they didn't even get British Rail, although sometimes I think some of those trains must have existed in those days. But nevertheless, they would travel on horseback. There's an interesting expression there that says, we made ready, in for example, chapter 21. And it can be translated, we hired horses. And that's really how Paul would make many of his journeys, because obviously, for a journey as long as the ones that he undertook, he would have need of a little more than a knapsack on his back. He would need quite a lot of provision and materials to go along with him. And they would use pack horses, and they would ride horses for a journey like that. Now, we can't spend any time in Thessalonica, or in the other town that's mentioned in that chapter, the town of Berea. They're both very interesting, obviously, because there was a large Jewish population in Thessalonica, and as usually happened where the Jews were to be found, Paul ran into trouble, and it was under the persuasion of brethren whom he converted there to Thessalonica that Paul was induced to go by night down to this little place called Berea. In fact, history tells us that Berea was an out-of-the-way place. It was off the beaten track. There are several great differences between Thessalonica and Berea. One is, as I say, that Thessalonica was the capital of a province and consequently a city and a busy place. Berea, and it was on the main road, on the main highway, a busy highway. Berea was off the main highway. But there's a much more important difference that's remarked upon in that passage than that. Whilst in Berea, whilst in Thessalonica rather, he certainly got some response from the people. Nevertheless, he got a lot of trouble too. But when he got to Berea, you find that it said concerning the Bereans that they were more noble, verse 11, they were more noble than those of Thessalonica, for they daily searched the Scriptures to see whether these things were so. Now that's the most encouraging experience that Paul must have had in any city that he visited. Certainly it's not said of any other city in any of Paul's travels that the people received the word with all readiness of mind and daily searched the Scriptures to see whether these things were so. They didn't blindly swallow all that Paul and Silas told them, but they put the teaching to the test and they went to the Word of God and the Scriptures, and consequently there were people converted there. In fact, you read that it was brethren there, new converts, who persuaded him to leave for his own safety when the Jews followed him all the way from Thessalonica down to Berea. They found out where he was, evidently, and they went there to persecute him some more. And these brethren from Berea did a wonderful thing. They urged Paul to leave, and they urged him, well, they escorted him 200 miles all the way down south to the city of Athens. Silas and Timothy didn't go with him, they were left behind. And having brought Paul to Athens, the Berean brethren turned around again and went back up there, up north, taking with them a message from Paul to his young friends, urging them to meet him as soon as possible in the city of Athens. And so the picture that you have there in chapter 17 is of Paul alone in the city of Athens, waiting for his friends to arrive. And if you put 2 and 2 together, you come up with 14, at least as far as the days are concerned. He must have waited about 14 days altogether for his young friends to come down to Athens. Now, what we're going to be looking at tonight is how a Christian waits in a godless city. If you divide that section of the chapter up, verses 16 to 21, and then you have verses 22 to 33, to 34. We're looking at the initial impressions. First of all, initial impressions that Athens made on Paul, and initial impressions that Paul made on Athens. And then we'll have a look at the final impressions later on in the chapter. Now, what impression did Athens make on him? Well, verse 16 tells you. And notice that word provoked. It says there in verse 16 that his spirit was provoked within him. You see that? His spirit was provoked within him. That's a very strong word. It means there was turmoil, he was disturbed, he was moved deeply. Perhaps there's a sense of irritation and frustration there, a sense of indignation involved in that word. He was indignant at what he saw in Athens. Oh yes, I have no doubt that on this, the first and in all probability the only visit that Paul made to Athens, his interest was aroused. But by what was it aroused? Was it aroused by the things that normal tourists and travellers were interested in when they got to Athens? I don't think so. You know, Athens is still a very interesting city for those who've been. Very interesting indeed, particularly if you're interested in history. And I don't have to tell you that tourists flock in their hundreds of thousands to see these ancient buildings. Let's say the centre of ancient education, the centre of ancient art, and the centre of ancient philosophy. A very interesting city indeed, and very attractive even today. But you must imagine it must have been much more attractive in the days of Paul, almost 2,000 years ago. By that time, the city, as Paul knew it, had been in existence for, well, perhaps almost 500 years. The heyday, Athens goes back to 1250 BC, or something like that, really. At least that's the traditional beginning of the city. But its heyday was around 450 BC, when Pericles was the administrator there, and many of the beautiful buildings, the ruins of which we see today, were erected at that time, 450 years before. The time when Socrates, the great philosopher, stood on Mars Hill and taught. That was Athens' greatest day. And many of the buildings that are now shells and ruins were there in Paul's day. Used, occupied. It was a beautiful city. And yet, you know, Paul ignored all that. Paul didn't go to Athens as a modern tourist goes. Here's the city that's the home of art. It's the home of learning. It's a city with beautiful architecture, with an interesting history. It's a city with magnificent sculptures. And yet Paul ignores it all. Oh yes, I know that he talked with some of their philosophers, the Stoics and the Epicureans, but for the most part, Paul was utterly indifferent to all the things that other people got enthusiastic about. You know, about 50 years after Paul went to Athens, there was another traveller went there. Pausanias was his name, and Pausanias wrote 6 volumes about Greece. And he spent more time describing Athens than any other city in the whole of the country. And he wrote all about its temples, and there were many temples, and its statues. They were all over the city. He spoke about the buildings and the statues being made of marble and gold and silver and wood. And Paul looked at the same statues. He saw them just the same. And he said, the city's full of idols. What a difference. As a matter of fact, this made Ernest Renan, the French skeptic, the French unbeliever, who wrote that book, The Life of Christ, which is interesting as a piece of literature, but not particularly interesting coming as it does from a man who didn't believe that Jesus is the Son of God. That man was so annoyed with Paul for saying it was full of idols that he said, that ugly little Jew abused Greek art by calling the statues idols. Well, you see, Paul was disturbed. Oh yes, he was moved. But he was disturbed because everything that he saw around him reeked of decay and death. It is true that Athens had a golden age. 400 years before Jesus came. But you know, Athens was a city living on its past, and it was a dead past. Everything about the city, even then, religiously and philosophically, was dead and dying. And somebody once said that Athens was living as a city trading on memories of achievements that were not its own, living on somebody else's accomplishment. And that's true. Pausanias, that traveller, reported that there were altars to all kinds of gods there. The Greeks didn't only make gods in the images of men. You think of Zeus and Apollo and women too, Venus. But they made gods named after human passions and human weaknesses and human emotions, human feelings. There was an idol to rumor. There was an idol to falsehood. Every single human emotion you can imagine had an altar there. And there was a god concerned with that particular altar. Now, Paul stumbled across one of those when he arrived in Athens. Now, he would actually come down from the north, from Thessalonica. And coming down from the north, he wouldn't be very long before he got into the Agora, the marketplace. Because, well, that's on the north side of the city, and they're still excavating and extending their discovery of the Agora, and all kinds of things that have come. You see, the marketplace in the Greek city wasn't like our marketplaces where people have stalls and they sell things. Oh yes, merchandise was exchanged in the Agora, the marketplace, but it was more than that. It was the meeting place for the town. The people came together in the Agora to exchange ideas and to exchange opinions, to exchange information. There were shrines there, and an altar. We saw an altar that was dedicated to 4 gods at the same time. Altars to all kinds of gods. Temples there to all kinds of gods. It was really the social and the religious center of the city. And people came there. They spent their time there. They met in groups and they discussed. Because the Athenians, as the passage says there, if you look at verse 21, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. That would be done in the Agora, in the marketplace. So Paul arrives there in Athens. He follows his usual practice. He goes to the synagogue first of all. Doesn't last very long in the synagogue. He's out of the synagogue and he's in the marketplace. And it's not very long before he's talking to these philosophers, these Stoics and the Epicureans about Christ and the resurrection. Now, what did they think about him? What impression did he make on Athens? Well, if you read what it says there, it wasn't very long before they couldn't understand him. They said he seems to be a setter forth of strange gods. And they called him a babbler. See the word babbler there in verse 18? They call him a babbler. What would this babbler say? Now that word babbler is the Greek word spermologos, and it means a seed picker. It describes a little bird that hops around on the ground picking up little bits of seed all the time. And it was used to describe a fellow who hung around his betters and listened to their conversation and then picked up snippets of their knowledge and passed it on as something very important, you know. A man who pretended to have an education and a learning that he didn't possess. This spermologos, this babbler, what's he talking about? And I can understand why they would do that. I suppose to these sophisticated Athenian philosophers, you know, dressed in the typical way that philosophers dressed in, this little Jew, because that's what he was, evidently, this little Jew who dressed in an un-Athenian way and who spoke with an un-Athenian accent, would be regarded as somebody of no consequence at all. And that's why they said, he seems to be setting forth some strange gods, foreign gods. Of course, they were the experts. The Epicureans and the Stoics, they were the real experts, and they believed that they were. For example, the Epicureans They were the followers of, well, the name says it, Epicurus. And Epicurus lived about 320 BC. He was the founder of that school of philosophical thought. And they were people who didn't believe in God anyway. So why would they listen to a man talking about a God? And they thought that the world came into existence by accident, and that the most important thing you can do in life is to enjoy yourself. You know, the idea, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Well, that was their philosophy. Make the most out of this life. You only live once. Have a good time while you're here. And now that's the... And we've got Epicureans around today, you know. The others were the Stoics. And they were the followers of another philosopher, just a little bit older, called Zeno. And actually, he died a year after Epicurus was born. And his philosophy was rather different. Well, of course, the Stoics didn't believe in a personal God, but at least they did believe in they did believe that the world came into existence as something that was created, but created by pure reason, they said. They didn't believe in a future life. That's why this business of the resurrection really stirred both of these groups of philosophers up. They believed that virtue is its own reward and vice is its own blessing. And the most important thing in life is the exercise of self-control. Don't allow the events that happen to you to influence you at all. And don't ever imagine there's a God who's concerned about you. Why, the Greeks didn't believe that God was interested in mankind, because they had the idea that if your condition could influence God at all, you could exercise some kind of control and some kind of authority over him. They didn't believe that God could be influenced by man or by man's experiences. So they had to say that God was apathetic. That's the word that they used. God was apathetic. Apathes is the word. Not interested, unmoved by the human condition. And so the Stoics said the best thing you can do is to hold on to life and don't allow anything to affect you. Don't let it put you up and don't let it take you down. Now, evidently Paul aroused the curiosity of these people, because the next thing you find is that they took hold of him. Now that expression doesn't mean they put their arms around his shoulder. It doesn't mean that they treated him badly, not as badly as he was treated in other places, but it does mean that they took hold of him and they took him before the Supreme Council. The Council of Ares that met at Mars Hill. Areopagus is the same word, the hill of Ares. And whenever you find that expression, they took hold of him, it means, in a sense, that they got hold of him and they compelled him to go with them. Now, if they thought he was such an important little fellow, why did they do that? Well, that council that I mentioned, the Areopagus, the Council of Ares, that met on that rocky mound in the open air, just below the Agora. And if you ever go there today, not the Agora, the Acropolis, if you ever go there today, go to Mars Hill as it's called, you'll find there's a bronze plaque that has been placed there that contains the whole of Paul's sermon on Mars Hill. It's there, of course, in the original Greek language, but you can see it there. Not very tall, not very high at all. You can climb up to the top of it in about 4 or 5 strides. It's just more like a pimple than a hill. Wouldn't really call it a hill. But nevertheless, it's a huge lump of rock, and that is where, in the open air, the Council of Ares met. Now, these were dignified people, and this was the oldest council, and no doubt the most revered, and at one time the most influential council that the Athenians had. And the reason why they took Paul to the council was that council had, among other things, the right to test any teacher that came to the city. They didn't take him there because they were interested in what Paul had to say and wanted somebody else to hear the message. They wanted him to be brought before the council to give reason why he should be allowed to teach and to display his qualification for teaching. Because you can understand that since Athens was the center of learning in those days, lots of men came from all parts of the country hoping to be able to teach in the city or to propound their doctrine and to make a living or to get some kind of reputation as a teacher. So the council of Ares would put these men to the test to make sure whether they had the qualifications. Well, and to discover whether or not what they were teaching was fit to be consumed by the people of Athens. Well, you can see what Paul had to say to these people. He starts off there at verse 22. And he begins by commenting on their religiousness. Now, many modern versions say, I perceive that you are in every way very religious. The Authorized Version, the King James Version says, I see that you are superstitious. And really, the word will stand either rendering, and, there's no doubt at all about it. The word superstitious perhaps comes pretty close to the truth when you consider what they really believed. Paul certainly believed that what these Athenians were following was pure superstition, worshipping idols, things that their own hands had made. He mentions that altar that he's seen. And he points out that it's, by the way, you'll notice that he seems to hint at their pantheism, their worship of many gods. Because he says, I saw an altar to an unknown God, not to the unknown God. Because archaeologists have discovered quite a number of altars to an unknown God. And you know why that was there, don't you? They believed in so many gods, and as I said, they put gods up to everybody and everything they could think of. But just in case there happened to be a God about whom they didn't know, and just in case that God that they didn't know about was more powerful than any of the gods that they did know about, they thought they'd better put up an altar to an unknown God, because they didn't want to make him angry. And if they made him angry, they were scared of what he might do. So just filling the gap, just sort of hedging their bets, if I may use that term, they put up this extra altar, or several altars of the same kind. And Paul comments on that fact. He says, now, you've got altars to unknown gods. Well, I'm going to tell you, God is not unknown. And the true God is not unknowable. Because the true God has made himself known. He points out, first of all, that God has revealed himself in the world of created things. Look at verse 24. The God who made the world and everything in it. Huh? So that's an assertion that the God that he believed in was the God who created. Now, it means that contrary to what those philosophers might have thought, the world didn't come into existence by chance, but came into existence by design. And you can't have a design without having a designer. And you can't have a design without having thought. And you can't have thought without a thinker. And the thinker is a person. So Paul is pointing out that the Creator is a person, is a being. Now, of course, they believed in pantheism, and they believed in polytheism. Polytheism is the worship of many gods. Pantheism said, and this is what the Stoics said, that the universe is God. Everything is God. There are bits of God everywhere. In the stones, in the trees, in the plants, in the animals, in the people. The sum total of the universe is God. And they would speak of the pleroma, the fullness of God. Paul says, no. God is not abstract. God is a designer. God is a creator. And furthermore, since he is the creator, he was not created. On the contrary, he created man. That's the big difference between the gods the Greeks worshipped and the God whom Paul served. They worshipped what they themselves had made. Idols are man-made. They have no life in themselves. God is not made. God is self-existent. God has independent life. He is self-sustaining. He has life in himself. Man made idols. God makes man. And since, Paul says, since man did not create God, don't ever think you can house him in a shrine or a temple. He doesn't need to be housed in the way you house your idols. Why, Solomon knew that. If you go back to the prayer of Solomon at the dedication of the first temple that was built way back in the Old Testament times, Solomon said, "And shall God in very deed dwell on earth? Behold, heaven and the heaven of heavens cannot contain thee, how much less this house which I have built." And didn't Stephen say the same thing before they stoned him? "The Most High dwelleth not in temples made with hands." And again, since man did not make God, God doesn't depend on man. That's what Paul says in verse 25. He says in verse 25, "He is not served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all men life and breath and everything." So, he doesn't need anything from us, but we need him, because in him we live and move and have our being. That's what he says. And then he comes to the climax of the message. He says, "Now in the past you've been ignorant." And they may have an excuse for your ignorance, but the times of ignorance God overlooked. But now commands all men everywhere to repent, inasmuch as he has appointed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he has appointed, whereof he's given assurance to all men, in that he's raised him from the dead. He's talking about Jesus. He says that, okay, you've been ignorant in the past, but that's gone. There's no excuse for ignorance today, because God has revealed himself. And God has appointed a judgment day. Not only has the day been set aside, not only is the day reserved, but the judge has been appointed. And the one appointed to be judge is the one to whom God has testified by raising him from the dead. And at that point, everything fell apart. I have no doubt they listened with interest to the reason and to the logic. He even quoted one of their own poets there in his message. They listened with interest up to that point. But when he said, "raised from the dead," that's when everything fell apart. Some mocked him. As you know, they didn't believe in the resurrection. Some mocked him. Others were more serious about it. They said, we'll hear you again in this matter. And Paul left them. That's what brought the hearing to a close. Now, there's no word, not a suggestion, that Paul established a church in Athens. And it almost seems, I'm sort of reading between the lines here, I may be wrong, but I don't think I am wrong here. Reading between the lines, it almost seems as if Paul felt that his visit to Athens was a failure. And I'll tell you why. Because the next place he visited was Corinth. And if you read his letter to the Corinthians, he says to the Corinthians, "When I came, I determined to know nothing at all among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." And that word, "I determined," I weighed it up, I thought about it. You know? I thought about it. It's almost as if he says, now, what went wrong in Athens? I took the wrong line. I tried to meet them on their own ground. I tried to philosophize with them. I didn't preach the simple message of Jesus. But he says to the Corinthians, when I came to you, I determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. But of course, Athens wasn't a failure, really. Because if you read the narrative, there were people who believed. There's a man called Dionysius. Well, it was an Areopagite, in other words, a member of the council believed. There was a woman who also must have been a member of the council to be there at the hearing, because had she not been a member of the council, her presence would not have been tolerated. And it was an unusual thing for a woman to be permitted to be a member of the council of Ares. So she must have been a very unusual woman. Well, she certainly had an unusual name. She was named Damaris. Now, women in those days had the names of birds and animals quite often. You've read earlier in the book of Acts of a woman called Dorcas, and the name Dorcas means gazelle. Damaris is not quite so attractive. Damaris means heifer. So She may have been a very distinguished lady, but she didn't have a very distinguished name. It's a bit unfortunate to be called a heifer. However, she also listened to the message and responded and obeyed, and these people believed and became Christians. Now, what can we learn from this? Well, I don't think we're very far from the days of Paul in one sense, when you think about it. We still live in an age when a great many pseudo-intellectuals and cultured people believe in ridiculous things. Horoscopes, astrology, witchcraft, black magic, all the so-called occult arts seem to be thriving today. Thriving among people who would think themselves too intellectual to believe in the Bible, to read what the Bible says, but they're not so intellectual as to be above dabbling in superstition and stupidity. They still worship the goddess of the physical, Demeter. They still worship the goddess of the intellectual, Athens. Or the god of force, Zeus. Rumor, the god of rumor. Well, he gets his scriptures printed every day in your newspapers. And there are altars to shame everywhere. And we know that. And the Stoics are still here. The people who are just as indifferent and as unconcerned as they were in the days of Paul. And the Epicureans are very much alive today. People who think that the sole reason for their existence is to have a good time. I'm all right, Jack, is the philosophy of so many of these people. Look after number one. That's it. You know the old Yorkshireman's prayer. Everybody knows the Yorkshireman's prayer. Eh? God bless me and my wife, our Joe and his wife, us four no more, amen. That's the philosophy of many people today, but it is, have a good time, make the most of life, and you only live once. We're living in a very materialistic age. And as Christians, we ought to feel as disturbed and as provoked as Paul did. We should refuse to let the world press us into its mold, so that we become indifferent about these things and just take them in our stride. We become insensitive to the error and the evil that fills our world. And I think that Acts 17 verse 30 ought to be our message today. The time of ignorance God overlooked, but now commands all men everywhere.
Time is filled with swift transition. Naught of earth unmoved can stand. Build your hopes on things eternal. Hold to God's unchanging hand. Hold to his hand, to God's unchanging hand. Hold to his hand, to God's unchanging hand. Build your hopes on things eternal. Hold to God's unchanging hand. Trust in him who will not leave you, whatsoever years may bring. If by earthly friends forsaken, still more closely to him cling. Hold to his hand, to God's unchanging hand. Hold to his hand, to God's unchanging hand. Build your hopes on things eternal. Hold to God's unchanging hand. Covet not this world's vain riches that so rapidly decay. Seek to gain the heavenly treasures, they will never pass away. Hold to his hand, to God God's unchanging hand. Hold to his hand, to God's unchanging hand. Build your hopes on things eternal. Hold to God's unchanging hand. When your journey is completed, if to God you have been true, fair and bright the home in glory, your enraptured soul will view. Hold to his hand, to God's unchanging hand. Hold to his hand, to God's unchanging hand. Build your hopes on things eternal. Hold to God's unchanging hand. Sing to me of heaven, sing that song of peace. From the toils that bind me, it will bring release. Burdens will be lifted that are pressing so. Showers of great blessings o'er my heart will flow. Sing to me of heaven, let me fondly dream of its golden glory, of its pearly gleam. Sing to me when shadows of the evening fall. Sing to me of heaven, sweetest song of all. Sing to me of heaven as I walk alone, dreaming of the comrades that so long have gone. In a fairer region long the angel throng, they are happy as they sing that old sweet song. Sing to me of heaven, let me fondly dream of its golden glory, of its pearly gleam. Sing to me when shadows of the evening fall. Sing to me of heaven, sweetest song of all. Sing to me of heaven tenderly and low, till the shadows o'er me rise and swiftly go. When my heart is weary, when my day is long, sing to me of heaven, sing that old sweet song. Sing to me of heaven, let me fondly dream of its golden glory, of its pearly gleam. Sing to me when shadows of the evening fall. Sing to me of heaven, sweetest song of all.